He was a powerful millionaire, the owner of an exclusive restaurant, until he made one fatal mistake. When Big Shaq tried to buy a meal for a struggling mother and her kids, Richard Calloway refused to serve them. Humiliated and arrogant, he never imagined the world would turn against him. But karma never forgets. Within days, his empire collapsed, his secrets were exposed, and the man who once looked down on the helpless became one of them. And the only person left to help him? The very man he turned away. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. Shaquille O'Neal, or Big Shaq as the world called him, had never let fame or fortune change who he was at his core. A man with a heart far bigger than his 7-foot frame. Even after retiring from basketball, he had made it his mission to give back, to help those who couldn't help themselves. Money was never the goal. Making a difference was. On this particular afternoon, he was cruising through the streets of downtown, the city bustling with life, but his eyes weren't on the towering skyscrapers or the fancy stores lining the sidewalks. His gaze drifted to the less fortunate, the ones no one paid attention to, the street performers, the exhausted workers, and the hungry souls searching for scraps. At a red light, something caught his attention. A mother and her 2 young kids stood near an alleyway, rummaging through a trash bin. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. He had seen suffering before, but something about this moment hit him differently. The mother, her clothes worn and tattered, clutched her little girl's hand while her son, no older than 10, desperately searched through discarded food containers. His stomach clenched at the sight. The light turned green, but Shaq didn't move. Cars honked behind him, impatient drivers shouting out their windows. He didn't care. Rolling down his window, he called out, "Hey, y'all okay?" The mother flinched, pulling her kids close. Her wary eyes darted toward him, then down at his luxury SUV, then back at him again. He could see the exhaustion on her face, the hesitation. She didn't trust kindness. "We're fine," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Shaq knew better. "Come on, let me get y'all some real food," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "Ain't nobody should be out here like this." The little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, I'm hungry," she whispered. The mother's face crumbled. That was all it took. With a heavy sigh, she nodded. Shaq parked and stepped out, towering over the 3 of them, but his presence wasn't intimidating. It was comforting. He led them toward La Maison, an upscale restaurant just around the corner. It was the kind of place where white tablecloths were pristine, wine glasses sparkled under chandeliers, and waiters walked with an air of superiority. But none of that mattered to Shaq. As they approached, the mother hesitated. "I don't think you let me handle this," Shaq interrupted with a reassuring smile. "Y'all deserve a hot meal, just like anybody else." What he didn't notice, however, was a pair of watchful eyes staring down at them from a second-floor window. Richard Calloway had built La Maison from the ground up, a restaurant that catered to the city's elite. He prided himself on exclusivity. Only a certain kind of clientele belonged here. And now, as he peered through his office window, he saw a sight that made his blood boil. Shaquille O'Neal, a man who didn't need to prove anything to anyone, was bringing in beggars. Richard's jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists. He had worked too hard, built too much, to let someone taint his establishment like this. This wasn't about money. It was about status. And in his mind, people like them didn't belong. Slamming his office door behind him, he stormed downstairs, ready to put an end to whatever was happening. Meanwhile, Shaq stepped through the restaurant's entrance with the family, his presence commanding attention. Conversations hushed, silverware clinked against plates, and all eyes turned toward them. The mother shrank under the weight of the stares. Even the children felt it. They clutched at their mother's arms, sensing the unspoken judgment in the room. A hostess, a young woman with wide, nervous eyes, hesitated before approaching. Good afternoon, Mr. O'Neal," she said, forcing a smile. "Would you like your usual table?" Shaq shook his head. "Nah, not today. I need a table for 4. Her gaze flickered to the family, her smile faltering. "Sir, are they dining with you?" Shaq's expression hardened slightly. "That a problem?" Before she could respond, a sharp voice cut through the air like a knife. Yes, actually, it is. Shaq turned to see Richard Calloway, his face flushed with barely contained anger. The room grew even quieter, tension crackling in the air like an oncoming storm. Richard folded his arms, his eyes locked onto Shaq's. I don't think you understand, Mr. O'Neill. This is an exclusive establishment. We don't serve charity cases. A hush fell over the room. Someone gasped. A waiter froze mid-step. Even the mother's breathing hitched, her fingers gripping her daughter's hand. Shaq took a slow, steady breath. He had dealt with a lifetime of this nonsense. The whispers, the judgment, the ones who saw his skin before they saw the man. But this? Right in front of two hungry children? His jaw clenched, but his voice stayed calm. They're not charity cases. They're people. They're hungry. And I brought them here to eat. Richard let out a cold laugh. I don't care if you're Shaquille O'Neal or the president himself. I choose who gets served here, and I say they don't. For the first time, the little boy spoke up. His voice was barely above a whisper. Mister, we just wanted some food. The restaurant was dead silent. Shaq exhaled, a slow and measured breath, his patience running dangerously thin. You're really gonna do this? In front of all these people? Richard's smirk didn't falter. I don't need to explain myself to you. But what Richard didn't realize was that someone had been recording the whole exchange. The young waitress who had been hesitant earlier had her phone in hand, the camera rolling. Every word, every sneer, every ounce of Richard's arrogance, captured. Shaq saw the phone, but he said nothing. Instead, he looked Richard in the eye, his voice dropping lower. You'll regret this. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. Without another word, Shaq turned to the mother and her kids. Come on, he said gently. We'll find somewhere better. As they stepped out, the restaurant remained frozen in awkward, stifling silence. The tension lingered, thick and suffocating. And upstairs, the waitress hit upload. As soon as Shaq and the family stepped inside La Maison, the entire atmosphere shifted. The low hum of conversation died down. Forks clinked against plates, but even those sounds faded into eerie silence. Every pair of eyes in the restaurant turned toward the entrance, their gazes flicking between Shaq's towering frame and the weary mother clutching her children's hands. The air thickened with discomfort. Waiters exchanged uneasy glances. A hostess near the podium instinctively straightened her dress, her smile faltering. A few diners, mostly well-dressed couples and businessmen, leaned in and began whispering amongst themselves. Shaq felt it all. The judgment, the unspoken words, the invisible wall they were trying to put between themselves and the family at his side. But he had walked into enough rooms like this to know that their discomfort wasn't his problem. Right now, all that mattered was getting these three a warm meal. He stepped forward, his presence commanding. Table for 4, he said, his voice steady. The young hostess hesitated, glancing toward the back of the restaurant, where Richard Calloway had just stepped out of his office. The moment Richard laid eyes on Shaq and the family, his face twisted in disgust. His grip on the notepad he was holding tightened, and his entire body stiffened. Shaq saw him approaching but didn't react. He had dealt with men like Richard before, the kind who believed money gave them the right to decide who mattered and who didn't. Richard stopped a few feet away, his expression carved from stone. His voice, however, was dripping with contempt. We don't serve people like them here. The mother stiffened. Her fingers, already tightly wrapped around her daughter's tiny hand, trembled. The little boy instinctively stepped closer to Shaq, as if the sheer size of the man could shield him from whatever was happening. Shaq exhaled through his nose, his patience hanging by a thread. They're human. They're hungry. That's all that matters. The whispering around them grew louder. Some customers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the scene unfolding in front of them. A few looked away, pretending not to notice. No one spoke up. No one challenged Richard. The mother swallowed hard and tried again. Please, I said no, Richard snapped, his voice sharper this time. His eyes flared with something ugly, something beyond arrogance, a deep-rooted belief that his word was law. Shaq squared his shoulders, his gaze locking onto Richard's. You sure about this? His tone was controlled, but there was a weight behind it, a quiet warning. Richard let out a cold chuckle. I'm more than sure. This is my establishment. I decide who gets to dine here. The little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve, her voice barely above a whisper. Mama, I'm hungry. Shaq's jaw clenched. He wasn't a man who lost his temper easily. He had learned, over the years, that anger rarely changed anything. But right now, standing in the middle of a restaurant filled with people who would rather watch in silence than stand against blatant discrimination, it took everything in him to keep his frustration in check. You're turning away kids? Shaq asked, his voice lower now, measured. Richard smirked. They're not my problem. For a second, the entire room held its breath. And then, from the far side of the restaurant, a quiet voice broke through the tension. I'll pay for their meal. All heads turned toward a woman sitting near the window. She was in her late 50s, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun. Her eyes, sharp and filled with something unreadable, stayed locked on Richard. I'll cover their bill, she said again, her voice firm. Richard's expression darkened. He knew who she was, Margaret Lively, a longtime patron, someone with just as much money as he had, if not more. He couldn't dismiss her like he had the others. But he also couldn't back down without looking weak. His jaw tightened. That's not the issue. Then what is? Margaret challenged, arching a brow. Richard's lips parted, but no words came out. He had backed himself into a corner. He knew it. Everyone knew it. Shaq didn't give him a chance to recover. He turned to the mother and her kids, his voice gentle. We don't need food from this place. Let's go. The mother hesitated, glancing at Margaret, then back at Shaq. She nodded quickly, as if afraid that staying any longer would only make things worse. Shaq placed a reassuring hand on the little boy's shoulder, guiding them toward the exit. But just as he reached the door, he turned back to Richard, his gaze unreadable. You'll regret this. It wasn't a threat. It was a certainty. Richard scoffed. I doubt that. Shaq didn't bother responding. He simply pushed open the door and stepped outside, leading the mother and her children away from a place that had never deserved their presence to begin with. Back inside, Margaret stood from her table, leaving her untouched meal behind. Without a word, she picked up her coat, slung her purse over her shoulder, and walked out as well. A ripple effect began. One by one, diners started getting up. Some did it out of protest, others out of sheer discomfort, but within minutes, a quarter of the restaurant was empty. The waitstaff, still frozen in place, exchanged glances. A few whispered amongst themselves, stealing nervous looks toward Richard, who stood at the center of it all, rigid, furious, and completely unaware of what was coming. Because what Richard didn't know was that someone had been recording the entire exchange. Near the bar, a young waitress had her phone in hand, capturing everything. Richard's arrogance, Shaq's restraint, the way the mother had tried to speak up, but had been silenced by the weight of power and prejudice. She didn't hesitate. She uploaded the video to social media with the caption, "This is how La Maison treats struggling families, even when Shaquille O'Neal tried to help. Unacceptable." And just like that, the fire was lit. The air in La Maison remained thick with tension, even after Shaq and the struggling family walked out. The silence left behind was suffocating. Some customers kept their heads down, focusing on their half-eaten meals, pretending they had just witnessed a normal exchange. Others whispered amongst themselves, their discomfort obvious. A few looked toward Richard Calloway, waiting to see if he had any regrets, any moment of self-awareness. But Richard stood firm, his arms crossed over his chest, his face carved from arrogance. His eyes flicked toward the young waitress near the bar, the one who had been secretly recording everything. Samantha Rivers had worked at La Maison for nearly 2 years, and in that time, she had learned one truth. Richard Calloway was untouchable. The staff feared him. They put up with his cutting remarks, his constant belittling, his belief that he was superior to everyone else in the room. But this was different. Her hands trembled slightly as she hit upload on her phone screen. She had hesitated at first, knowing full well that if Richard found out, she'd lose her job. But something about the way he had looked at that mother, like she was nothing, like she didn't deserve to be in his presence, lit a fire inside her. She couldn't let it slide. The caption read, "This is how La Maison treats struggling families, even when Shaquille O'Neal himself tries to help. Unacceptable." And just like that, the first spark ignited. Richard turned back toward the restaurant, letting out a breath of irritation. He had expected Shaq to put up more of a fight, to argue, to demand service. But the fact that the basketball legend had simply walked away, it gnawed at him. He wanted to believe he had won, but something about the way Shaq had looked at him before leaving sent a chill through him. "You'll regret this." The words echoed in his mind, though he pushed them away. What could Shaq possibly do? He was just another washed-up athlete throwing money at people to ease his conscience. Richard smirked to himself and turned toward the customers. "Well," he said, loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear, "glad that little show is over." A few uneasy chuckles rippled through the crowd, but most people remained silent. It was a silence Richard should have feared. At first, the video didn't pick up much traction. A few hundred views, a handful of comments. Some people outraged, others defending Richard, claiming he had a right to refuse service to whomever he wanted. Then, an NBA fan account shared the post. Within minutes, the numbers skyrocketed. 10,000 views, then 50, then 100,000. By the time the clip hit 1 million, mainstream media picked it up. News anchors debated the morality of the situation. Talk show hosts called Richard a disgrace. Former restaurant employees, ones who had left quietly, afraid of retaliation, began speaking out. "He's always been like this," one former server tweeted. "He looks at the wrong people like they're trash. This isn't new." The hashtag #boycott La Maison started trending. Celebrities chimed in. Some called for a boycott. Others offered to buy the family a meal at any restaurant of their choice. And Shaq? Shaq stayed silent. He didn't make a statement. He didn't tweet. He didn't go live to address the controversy. He didn't need to. The world was speaking for him. Inside his office, Richard sat behind his desk, phone in hand, scrolling through the flood of notifications. His restaurant's Yelp rating had dropped from 5 stars to 2 in a matter of hours. Comments poured in. Trash owner. Trash establishment. This guy really denied food to kids? In front of Shaq? Clown behavior? Hope your business crashes and burns. Richard scoffed, tossing his phone onto the desk. "It's just the internet," he muttered under his breath. "This'll blow over." A knock at the door pulled his attention. It was Jason, his restaurant's manager, his face pale. Richard, we have a problem." "What now?" Richard snapped. Jason hesitated. "We just lost our biggest investor." Richard froze. Jason continued, "And 2 of our suppliers just pulled out. They don't want to be associated with bad press." Richard stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Are you telling me people are actually taking this seriously?" Jason swallowed hard. "It's worse than that." He hesitated, then slid his phone across the desk. The screen showed a petition, one with over 500,000 signatures, demanding the permanent closure of La Maison. Richard's hands curled into fists. His empire, his legacy, was crumbling before his very eyes. While Richard panicked behind closed doors, Shaq was doing what he always did, helping people. The morning after the controversy exploded, he found the mother and her kids. He didn't just buy them a meal, he bought them a home, a brand new apartment, fully furnished, stocked with food and everything they needed to start over. He paid for the kids' school tuition for the next 5 years. But Shaq didn't boast about it. He didn't call a press conference. He did it quietly. The only reason the world found out was because a local reporter happened to be covering the aftermath of the incident when she saw Shaq handing over the apartment keys to the mother, who broke down in tears. The video surfaced online. People lost their minds. This is how you respond to hate, with love. Shaq is a real one, always has been. Richard Calloway destroyed himself in a single night. Meanwhile, Shaq is out here changing lives. And with that, the contrast between the 2 men became clear. One was a man who built his empire on exclusion. The other, a man who used his wealth to lift people up. Guess which one the world respected? 3 days after the incident, La Maison was empty. The once bustling restaurant was a ghost town. Servers stood around with nothing to do. A few regulars trickled in, but most didn't stay long. Outside, protesters lined the sidewalk, holding signs that read, "Humanity over hate," and "We don't eat where discrimination lives." Inside, Richard sat at the bar, a glass of whiskey in front of him, untouched. His eyes flicked up to the news playing on the restaurant's TV. The headline? Shaquille O'Neal changes lives while restaurant owner faces backlash. His name was poison now. Sponsors had cut ties. His business partners weren't returning his calls. Investors had pulled out completely. And then came the final blow. His lawyer walked in, a grim look on his face. "We need to talk," he said. "It's about the lawsuit." Richard's stomach dropped. "What lawsuit?" The lawyer placed a folder on the bar counter. "Discrimination case. You're being sued." Richard's hands trembled as he opened the folder, scanning the documents. His entire world was imploding, piece by piece. And Shaq hadn't even lifted a finger to make it happen. Richard Calloway had spent years building La Maison into a high-end restaurant that catered to the city's wealthiest. He considered himself a man of power, someone who could control any situation with the right amount of money and influence. So, when the confrontation with Shaq went viral, he wasn't concerned. Sitting in his office that night, whiskey glass in hand, he scrolled through his phone, barely glancing at the thousands of notifications piling up. He let out a dry chuckle. People online loved outrage. Give them a few days, and they'd move on to the next scandal. He had seen it happen before. He took a slow sip of his drink, then smirked. People will forget in a week. But Richard had no idea what was coming. It started with one tweet. A well-known NBA analyst reposted the video of the incident with the caption, "Shaquille O'Neal tried to help a struggling mother and her kids, and this man refused them service? Disgusting." The tweet exploded within minutes. Retweets, comments, celebrities weighing in, athletes, musicians, actors, all calling out the blatant racism. Then, another wave hit. La Maison is done. Boycott La Maison. Richard Calloway is a disgrace. He turned away hungry kids in front of Shaq. If you eat at La Maison after this, you're part of the problem. By midnight, the hashtag #1 Boycott La Maison was the #1 trending topic in the country. And it didn't stop there. La Maison's Google rating nosedived. Customers, past and present, flooded the restaurant's page with one-star reviews. Some shared their own unpleasant encounters with Richard. Others simply posted the words, "We don't support hate." Within hours, the restaurant dropped from a 5-star establishment to a 1.2-star disaster. Yelp followed, then TripAdvisor. By morning, La Maison's online reputation was in ruins. Richard still wasn't fazed. "It's just noise," he muttered to himself. He could delete the reviews, clean up the PR mess, and move on. But then, the media got involved. By sunrise, the controversy had jumped from social media to national television. CNN ran a segment titled, "Racism at La Maison? Shaquille O'Neal at the center of restaurant backlash." ESPN aired the footage, discussing not just the incident, but Shaq's history of generosity. Talk show hosts roasted Richard mercilessly, mocking his arrogance and calling him out for his ignorance. One late-night host quipped, "Imagine being so racist you tell Shaq to leave your restaurant. That's like refusing to serve Santa Claus." The audience erupted in laughter. And just like that, Richard became a national joke. The first major sponsor pulled out that afternoon. A luxury wine brand that had partnered with La Maison for years issued a public statement, distancing itself from the restaurant. They wanted no connection to Richard Calloway. Within hours, 2 more sponsors followed. By the end of the day, all of La Maison's high-end partnerships were gone. Even the suppliers, who provided the restaurant with premium ingredients, started cutting ties. They didn't want to be associated with a scandal that was now on every news channel in America. But Richard still refused to see the danger. Sitting in his office, he waved Jason, his manager, off. "This will pass," he insisted. "People are emotional. Give them time." Jason hesitated before placing his phone on Richard's desk. The screen showed a video of a massive crowd forming outside the restaurant. Richard frowned. "What the hell is this?" Jason swallowed hard. The protesters. By the second day, a mob of protesters lined the sidewalk outside La Maison. They carried signs that read, "Racism won't be served here," and "Feed the hungry, not your ego." Chants echoed through the street. "Shut it down! Shut it down!" News cameras rolled as protesters blocked the entrance. They weren't just locals. People had driven in from neighboring towns to stand against Richard Calloway and everything he represented. Shaq still hadn't said a word. He didn't have to. The world was speaking for him. Inside the restaurant, panic spread like wildfire. Half the reservations for the night had been canceled. The phone rang non-stop, not with new bookings, but with people demanding refunds and vowing never to return. The kitchen staff whispered amongst themselves, uncertain if they'd even have jobs by the end of the week. Servers watched helplessly as more and more tables emptied out. By evening, the restaurant was barely at 30% capacity. A place that once had a month-long waiting list now struggled to fill seats. Richard paced in his office, his confidence starting to crack. He had always believed that money and reputation would shield him. But this was different. This wasn't just a bad review or a single disgruntled customer. This was an entire country turning against him, and for the first time, he felt it slipping away. That night, as the restaurant closed early due to lack of business, Richard stood by the window, staring out at the protesters still chanting under the streetlights. His restaurant, once a symbol of exclusivity and success, now represented something far uglier. And worst of all, Shaq never even had to fight back. He didn't make threats. He didn't argue. He just walked away, and the world responded for him. As Richard turned away from the window, his phone buzzed with a new notification. An email from his biggest investor. 2 words. "We're out." Richard sank into his chair, gripping his forehead. For the first time in his life, he felt small. And he knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning of his downfall. Richard Calloway sat in his office, staring at the walls that once made him feel invincible. La Maison had been his empire, his crown jewel, the proof of his success. But now those walls felt smaller, closing in on him with each passing hour. The restaurant was dying. Outside, the protesters still stood firm, their voices echoing into the night. Inside, the dining area, once packed with high-profile guests and social elites, was eerily quiet. The few customers that had come in left quickly, afraid of being associated with the controversy. The phone, once ringing with VIP reservations, was now silent. No one wanted a table at La Maison anymore. Jason, the restaurant's manager, stood hesitantly at the door. "Richard, we need to talk." Richard barely glanced up. "If it's about the protesters, I don't want to hear it." Jason shifted uncomfortably. "It's not just the protesters, it's everything." He placed a folder on Richard's desk. Richard ignored it at first, but when Jason didn't move, he sighed and flipped it open. His eyes scanned the contents, and his stomach dropped. Outstanding bills, late payments, supplier termination notices. Richard's hand clenched around the papers. "This is temporary." Jason exhaled. "It's not." He hesitated before adding, "We lost another investor today." Richard scoffed, tossing the papers aside. "Cowards. They'll come crawling back." Jason didn't reply, because they both knew the truth. No one was coming back. The backlash wasn't just about what had happened with Shaq. It was a floodgate opening. As La Maison crumbled, former employees started speaking out. The first was a former hostess, Madison Carter. She posted a lengthy statement on social media. "I worked at La Maison for 2 years. I saw how Richard Calloway treated people who didn't fit his standards. He would humiliate employees in front of customers, dock wages for the smallest infractions, and make racist remarks behind closed doors. This is who he's always been. The world just finally sees it." The post went viral, then came another. "I was a line cook at La Maison. Richard paid us minimum wage while telling customers they were eating world-class cuisine. If we complained, fired, no severance, just gone." And another. "I once saw Richard tell a black couple they didn't belong in his restaurant. That was 5 years ago. I regret not speaking up sooner." One by one, Richard's past caught up with him. News networks picked up the stories. Reporters dug deeper. They found old complaints filed against La Maison, claims of wage theft, discrimination, verbal abuse. Some had been settled quietly, others had been buried. But now, everything was out in the open. And then came the worst blow of all. Jason stood in Richard's office again, this time holding a legal document. His face was grim. "Richard, we have a serious problem." Richard snatched the papers from his hand and skimmed the contents. His blood ran cold. A lawsuit, filed by multiple former employees, accusing him of workplace discrimination, wage theft, and wrongful termination. "This is ridiculous," Richard scoffed. "They're just jumping on the bandwagon." Jason's voice was careful. "The case is strong, Richard. They have evidence. Witnesses." Richard's hands trembled as he tossed the papers onto his desk. "It won't hold up." Jason didn't argue, but his silence said enough. Richard wasn't just losing his business. He was about to lose everything. The next morning, Richard arrived at La Maison, expecting to see his staff preparing for another day of business. Instead, he walked into a half-empty restaurant. Half his employees had quit overnight. His head chef was gone. His best servers had walked out. Even his cleaning crew had abandoned him. Jason was waiting for him near the entrance. His expression was unreadable. They didn't want to be part of this anymore. Richard's fists clenched. "I'll hire new people." Jason shook his head. "No one wants to work here." Richard's jaw tightened, his mind scrambling for a solution. "I'll double their pay." Jason let out a dry laugh. "With what money?" Richard had no response. And then, the final betrayal came. His business partners, the ones who had stood by him for years, who had invested millions into La Maison, held a private meeting without him. By the afternoon, Richard received a single text message. "Effective immediately, we are dissolving our partnership with La Maison. You are on your own." Richard read it over and over, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps. They had abandoned him. Every safety net he thought he had. Gone. And for the first time since this all started, true fear settled in his chest. By the end of the week, La Maison was a ghost town. The few employees who stayed looked exhausted, going through the motions in a restaurant that was no longer respected, no longer desirable, no longer feared. The once glorious space where celebrities and CEOs once dined now felt cold and lifeless. The protesters were still outside. They weren't leaving. The bills kept piling up. The lawsuit wasn't going away. And Richard sat alone in his office, staring at the walls, realizing that the power he once held had turned to dust. But even then, his pride wouldn't let him ask for help. He told himself he could fix this, that he could rebuild, that he was still Richard Calloway, a man of influence. But deep down, he knew the truth. His reign was over, and he had done it to himself. Richard Calloway had always believed his name carried weight, that no matter what happened, his power, his reputation, and his fortune would shield him from any real consequences. But now, he sat alone in his office at La Maison, a dying empire crumbling around him. The restaurant was a ghost town. The phone didn't ring with reservations. The once loyal investors had cut ties. His staff had abandoned him. The once loyal customers? Now protesters outside his doors. He had thought the worst was over. He was wrong. Because the next betrayal was about to come from his own blood. The morning headlines sent shockwaves through the city. Jordan Calloway exposes his father's corruption. He's been doing this for years. Richard's own son, Jordan Calloway, had broken his silence. For years, Jordan had kept his distance from his father's business. He had stayed in the shadows, refusing to be involved in the world Richard built. But now he was speaking out. In a nationally televised interview, Jordan sat across from a well-known journalist. His face was solemn, his voice steady. "I stayed quiet for too long," Jordan admitted. "But I can't anymore." The interviewer leaned forward. "What made you decide to speak out now?" Jordan let out a breath, his hands clasped together. "Because my father isn't just a man who turned away a hungry family. He's a man who has spent years, decades, treating people like they were beneath him." The interviewer nodded. "Can you elaborate?" Jordan looked straight into the camera. "He's committed fraud, tax evasion, and wage theft. He's paid off officials to keep complaints buried. He's bullied employees into silence. And now, it's all finally catching up to him." The entire country watched in stunned silence. The truth had been spoken by the one person Richard never expected to betray him. Richard sat frozen in front of his office TV, his face pale as his own son's words exposed every dark secret he had worked so hard to bury. His fingers clenched the edge of his desk, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. Fraud, tax evasion, wage theft. Words that didn't just ruin reputations, they ruined lives. A knock on the door made him flinch. Jason, his now former manager, stepped in, holding a letter. His expression was unreadable. "It's official." Richard slowly took the envelope. His hands shook as he pulled out the legal notice. Effective immediately, Richard Calloway is removed from all business ventures associated with Calloway Enterprises. His heart pounded. They can't do this. Jason didn't flinch. They can. They just did. Richard's own partners had turned against him. His name, once associated with wealth and exclusivity, was now toxic. His businesses were stripped from him. His assets were frozen. His accounts under investigation. For the first time in his life, Richard Calloway was powerless. And it was all because of his son. The fallout was swift and brutal. Richard's homes were seized. His luxury cars repossessed. Every deal, every investment, every piece of his empire vanished overnight. The lawsuits stacked up, employees demanding justice, former business partners demanding repayment, government agencies launching full-scale investigations into his finances. By the time it was over, Richard Calloway was bankrupt, not struggling, not financially wounded, completely, utterly ruined. His last remaining properties, his penthouse, his vacation home, even his personal belongings, were all auctioned off to cover debts. And then, he was evicted. The man who once refused a meal to a starving family now had nowhere to sleep. The irony was almost cruel. The man who had once mocked the poor, turned away the hungry, and judged those who had nothing, now had less than them. He wandered the city streets, his expensive suit now wrinkled, dirty, and out of place. He had always looked down on people like this, the homeless, the forgotten. But now, as he passed by people who wouldn't even spare him a glance, he finally understood. No one cared about him anymore. Once, he had been respected, feared, admired, envied. Now, he was invisible. He sat on a park bench, his stomach aching from hunger. He had no money for food, no home to return to, and the world moved on without him. One evening, as the city lights flickered on, Richard found himself outside a small diner. The smell of fresh food made his stomach twist. He hadn't eaten properly in days. He swallowed his pride and stepped inside. The hostess gave him a once-over, her brows furrowing at his appearance. His suit was stained, his face unshaven, his posture defeated. "Sir, do you need a menu?" she asked hesitantly. Richard's voice was hoarse. I don't have any money." The hostess glanced toward the manager, unsure what to do. But before she could respond, a deep, familiar voice cut through the tension. "I'll cover it." Richard turned sharply, and there, standing by the counter, was Shaquille O'Neal. For a moment, neither man spoke. Shaq's expression was unreadable, but his eyes held no hatred, no smug satisfaction, just quiet understanding. Richard's throat tightened. His pride screamed at him to refuse, but his stomach growled, his body weak from days without proper food. He swallowed hard and nodded. "Thank you." Shaq simply gestured toward a table. "Eat." Richard sat down, and moments later, a warm meal was placed in front of him. He stared at it, the reality of his situation crushing him from all sides. The very thing he had denied another person had now been freely given to him. And for the first time in his life, Richard Calloway finally understood what it felt like to be powerless. The night was bitterly cold. The city moved as it always did. Cars rushing by, neon signs flickering against the pavement, strangers walking past one another, lost in their own lives. But on a lonely park bench, away from the warmth of restaurants and the comfort of homes, Richard Calloway sat shivering. His coat, once a symbol of power and status, was now tattered and thin. His hands, which once signed million-dollar contracts, were cracked from the cold. His body ached, weakened by weeks of hunger, exhaustion, and the sheer weight of his downfall. No one recognized him anymore. The same city that had once feared his influence, admired his wealth, envied his success, now passed him by without a second glance. His stomach growled, but he had learned to ignore it. The hunger was just another part of his reality now, another thing to endure. Then, a shadow loomed over him. Richard stiffened, instinctively bracing himself, expecting some cop to tell him to move, or some stranger to sneer at him like he used to sneer at others. But the voice that followed was unexpectedly familiar. "Long way from La Maison, huh?" Richard looked up slowly, blinking against the streetlights. Shaquille O'Neal stood before him. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of past choices, past words, past mistakes. Richard swallowed hard, his pride screaming at him to look away, to pretend he didn't care, to pretend this moment wasn't humiliating. But he couldn't. Not anymore. Shaq sighed, slipping his hands into his jacket pockets. His voice wasn't mocking, wasn't cruel. It was calm, measured, real. "You eat today?" Richard hesitated. His throat was dry, his pride a tangled mess inside him. But in the end, he shook his head. Shaq exhaled, then motioned toward the sidewalk. "Come on." Richard stared at him, confused. "Where?" Shaq didn't answer immediately. He just gestured toward the diner across the street. The same one where, just days ago, he had bought Richard a meal without a second thought. The same one where Richard had been too ashamed to look him in the eye. Now Shaq was giving him another chance to accept what he had once refused others. Kindness. Richard hesitated. Not because he didn't want to eat, but because some small, wounded part of him still clung to the idea that accepting help meant admitting he had lost. Shaq must have sensed it because he sighed and sat down next to him on the bench. The wood creaked under his weight, but Shaq didn't seem to mind. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, looking ahead instead of at Richard. "Look, man, I don't know what you expect me to say." His voice was steady, unshaken. "You messed up. Big time." Richard let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a bitter sigh. "Yeah, I did." A pause. Shaq nodded slowly, as if acknowledging the truth of it. "But that don't mean you gotta stay down." Richard's fingers curled, his nails digging into his palms. Didn't it? What was left for him now? No business, no fortune, no name worth anything. "You think people like me get second chances?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Shaq finally turned to face him. "I think everyone does." Richard shook his head. "You don't get it." Shaq arched a brow. "I don't." Richard let out a breath. "I burned every bridge I had. I didn't just mess up. I ruined people's lives. I ran my own business into the ground. I threw away my reputation, my money, my family." His voice broke, but he pushed forward. "My own son hates me, and the worst part? I deserve it." Shaq didn't argue. He didn't tell him he was wrong. He just let Richard sit with his truth. After a moment, Shaq leaned back. "You know, I grew up watching my mom work 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. We didn't have much, but she made sure we had enough." His voice was softer now, edged with something almost nostalgic. Richard stayed silent, unsure where this was going. Shaq continued. "One night, I remember she got home late, real late. She was exhausted. I was just a kid, but I asked her why she worked so hard when people like her never got ahead." He paused, exhaling through his nose. "She looked me dead in the eye and said, 'Because how you treat people when you have power is what decides who you are when you lose it.'" Richard swallowed hard, because he knew exactly who he had been when he had power. And now? Now that it was gone? What did that make him? Shaq stood, stretching his arms. "Come on, man. Let's go get you a meal." Richard hesitated, looking down at his trembling hands. He wanted to refuse. He wanted to pretend he didn't need it. But he did. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't too proud to admit it. Slowly, cautiously, he reached up and took Shaq's hand. The grip was firm, steady, unshaken. As Shaq helped him to his feet, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The meal was simple: eggs, toast, a cup of coffee that warmed his fingers. But it was more than just food. It was a second chance. Richard ate quietly, the weight of everything he had lost still sitting heavy on his shoulders. But for the first time in weeks, he didn't feel like he was drowning. Shaq didn't talk much. He didn't lecture him, didn't gloat. Because this was never about revenge. It was about redemption. When Richard finished, he set his fork down carefully. He didn't know what to say, so he simply met Shaq's gaze and muttered, "Thank you." Shaq gave him a nod. "You want my advice?" Richard swallowed. "Yeah." Shaq leaned forward, his voice quiet but firm. "Do something good with whatever time you've got left." Richard felt the weight of those words settle into his chest. He had spent his life chasing power, and it had left him with nothing. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to chase something else. Days passed, then weeks. The world moved on, just as Richard once arrogantly believed it would. The headlines faded. The protests ended. La Maison was permanently closed, its doors locked, its windows boarded up. But Richard? Richard was starting over. He took a job at a small shelter downtown, helping people he once ignored. The work was humbling, long hours, heavy lifting. But for the first time in his life, he felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with money. He never tried to clear his name, never tried to rebuild his empire, because that wasn't who he was anymore. He had spent his whole life thinking kindness was weakness. But now he knew the truth. Kindness wasn't weakness. Hate destroys itself. And Richard Calloway? He had been lucky enough to realize it before it was too late. If this story moved you, let's turn its lesson into action. Stand against discrimination, support local shelters, and choose kindness every day. Together we can create a world where no one is turned away. Subscribe, share, and join us in making a difference, because real change starts with you.